Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. Is there a useful takeaway for you from my story? Permit me to suggest an important initial one. I'm a nobody. Nothing is personal. That applies to you, too, and everyone else. What? That's a radical idea, isn't it? You take yourself to be a person. However, if it's correct, what you take yourself to be is fundamentally wrong. Permit me to give an initial explanation of that error. In this video, I'll provide a general orientation. In the following video, I'll provide an orientation that follows from a popular, specific tradition that you're likely familiar with. When we step back from the details of our lives, it becomes clear to me that there are two fundamental attitudes about life. One is an attitude of delusion that manifests as incessant delusion, a dearth of love, and abiding underlying fear. The other is an attitude of diminishing delusion that manifests a bounty of love and a growing sense of peacefulness. More specifically, to make use again of Dr. Hawkins's map of the logarithmic scale of consciousness, those whose personal calibrations are 499 or lower live lives of the former kind, and those whose personal calibrations are 500 or higher live lives of the latter kind. It's important to understand that while we're living, our personal calibrations are not fixed. Like our body fat percentage, they can increase or decrease, sometimes dramatically. Dr. Hawkins's calibrated scale of consciousness is one such that, as he puts it in Power versus Force, the log of the whole numbers from 1 to 1,000 calibrates the degree of power of all possible levels of human awareness, end quote. The higher one's personal calibration, the happier one is. If so, therefore, to become happier, raise your personal calibration. Those at the lower end of the scale, whose calibrations are 199 or below, lead hellish lives. Those at the higher end of the scale, whose calibrations are 600 or higher, lead heavenly lives. They are sages. What's the most important point about sages in this context? Sagehood excludes personhood. Sages essentially identify with everyone and everything else. They are the greatest lovers. They are the saints, the successful philosophers, the wise. Love is unity, which is not only your true nature, but also everyone's true nature. As I've argued elsewhere, quote, to be a human being is to be like a tornado, end quote, from Are You Living Without Purpose? A good way to approach this critically important idea is to question yourself by asking, right now, who am I? Do not answer with your story. That happened in the past, which no longer exists. Do not answer with your dreams or planned projects. If they happen at all, they will happen in the future, what does not yet exist. Do not answer with your qualities, for they are commonalities. Since others may share them, they are not uniquely you. Suddenly, it becomes difficult to understand who or what you are, doesn't it? Because we have two sides to our nature, some sages, such as Eckhart Tolle, think that we're transitional figures between the animalistic and the angelic. We humans have two dimensions, namely becoming, that is temporal, and being, that is non-temporal. Who or what are you right now? If you wholly identify yourself only with forms and becoming and continue doing that, you'll live life without ever realizing your essential nature, which is being. Use the tornado analogy. What's a tornado? Well, there's all that stuff in flux swirling around its outside. Its primary nature or essence, though, is the stillness of its center. To connect the analogy to our topic, take thoughts to be like parts of stuff swirling around. Thoughts are mental noise, whereas mental silence is stillness. Thoughts are peripheral, whereas stillness is central. This won't make any sense without realizing that not all awareness involves thought, thinking, conceptualizing. Awareness, consciousness, alertness, wakefulness, can be separated into thought and no thought. Thought separates, no thought unites. Thinking requires conceptualizing, which is separating, sorting, dividing, classifying, categorizing. Hate and fear are spawned by separation, whereas love and peace are spawned by unity. Genuine love begins where thought leaves off. That's the demarcation between 499 and 500 on Dr. Hawkins's map of the scale of consciousness. If we cling to thought, 600 is a barrier that cannot be crossed. Sages are free from having to think. Unlike non-sages, they are free either to think or not to think. It's a bit like being a non-smoker. Non-smokers are free to smoke or not to smoke, but smokers are unfreed slaves. We approach sagehood when we detach sufficiently from identification with thought forms at 500. In other words, those whose personal calibrations are in the 500s are on the threshold of sagehood. Because they have detached significantly from identification with thought, their world is more unified and happier than those whose calibrations are 499 or lower. This permits them to love excellently. Giving is receiving. Love is giving. It's not taking or using. In fact, those whose personal calibrations are 540 or higher become capable of unconditional love. This explains why living better in the 500s or living well in the 600s or higher is simple but difficult. It requires detaching from thought, either an incomplete detachment in the 500s or a more thorough detachment at 600 or higher. 96% of human beings never raise their personal calibrations to 500 or higher. They never sufficiently break attachment with their thoughts, opinions, emotions, and egocentric desires. The result is a lack of freedom, imprisonment to their egos, their selves, rather than opening to genuine freedom, and lack of personhood in being. They look for lasting happiness where it cannot be found. They remain dissatisfied until death. They never achieve a sense of completion, fulfillment, purpose, or peace. Sometimes, spontaneous detachment from all forms and becoming occurs that provides a momentary glimpse of beatitude, grace, salvation, or peace. Unless such glimpses are widened and deepened with some sustained spiritual practice or other, however, they just recede into unimportant, though perhaps interesting, experiences. Typically, sufficient detachment from all forms and becoming occurs as the result of sustained spiritual practice. This explains why, for example, the Buddha said that there's no living well, nirvana, without meditation, and why Jesus said that there's no living well, the kingdom of God, without prayer. Both the Buddha and Jesus were talking about classic spiritual practices. Both the Buddha and Jesus had personal calibrations of 1,000, which is the highest possible. Reaching and sustaining a sufficient level of non-attachment at a personal calibration of 500 or higher requires persistently practicing in some effective way, which usually means mastering a meditative, spiritual, yogic practice. The good news is that doing that is a realistic option for nearly everyone. The bad news is that few people do it. Either they are ignorant that it's a possibility, or they are insufficiently motivated to do what's required. Nevertheless, once the value of no thought is understood, a personal calibration of 500 or higher is doable for nearly everyone. Most people do learn from their experiences, but usually personal calibrations don't increase more than 5 or 10 levels in a lifetime. However, hugely significant improvements are not only possible but also doable for those humble enough to practice properly detaching from egocentricity, in other words, clinging to self. The key to increasing happiness is letting go, surrendering, detaching, dropping. See, for example, Dr. Hawkins's letting go. The way to live well, contrary to popular practice, is constantly to practice letting go, rather than constantly trying to gain something that we imagine will make us happier. The workbook to A Course in Miracles, which itself calibrates at 600, states, quote, "Fear is not justified in any form," end quote. Fear is the other side of love. Quote, "What is fear except love's absence?" End quote. Compare that to the classic Christian idea that sin is distance from God. The lower our personal calibrations, the more egocentric and animalistic we are, the more we fear we experience. The higher our personal calibration, the less egocentric and less animalistic we are, the less fear we experience, the more love we experience, and the happier we are. If you'd like to understand this important idea more fully, you'll enjoy the next video. Peace.